Rudder Reviews, and before I begin with today's review, I want to remind folks out there that if you've been watching my channel, if you've been enjoying the content, and you're not subscribed yet, please do so. It would help me out a great deal. Just click that button below. But moving on to today's review, I actually want to take a look at a movie that actually just came out today, the 2021 film Death Trip. Directed by James Watts in his feature-length directorial debut, also written by James Watts and Kelly Kay. And in this Canadian movie, we have four friends that are going out and spending a weekend in a rural countryside cabin area. And when they get there, things are just kind of, well, a little bit off. As they drive up, one of the neighbors is just kind of is looking at them quite intently. Nothing really terribly off. It's just kind of stuff that's tough to put the finger on, but regardless, they are intent on having a weekend of fun together. And so Garrett, Melina, Tatiana, and Kelly are enjoying each other's company, having some drinks, having some laughs, and engaging with one another. There's a few other random events that happen, but there is kind of a sense of foreboding as they look out and they see their neighbor's property and they can see in the window, and there's just some backstory about their neighbor maybe having killed his wife and so on. There's a few odd pieces that just don't fit the entirety of the puzzle that kind of make them feel, well, uneasy. And I'd honestly love to discuss it more deeply than that, but I really have been trying to find a way to wrap my words around it that doesn't get into heavy spoiler territory, and it just doesn't seem to be really that easy. So suffice it to say, four friends, cabin, going out, having fun with one another, but there's something not quite right, foreboding. There you go. Now, this is a micro-budget indie horror movie, and although I have to say that as an overall motion picture, it really didn't gel for me that well, it was a bit surprising because this managed to avoid a lot of the most common pitfalls that indie horror movies wind up falling into. For instance, it actually looked really good. It didn't look like it was filmed with a potato. This actually has a good aesthetic style to it with the camera movement, the lighting, the color, and so on. It didn't look, multi-million-dollar project, but it looked good. Secondly, and I think honestly even more important, this actually had a good rapport with the characters, and that's something that's honestly difficult to pull off. For having four characters that are pretty much isolated for the most part throughout the entirety of the movie, they actually seem to have a very natural conversational feel to them. And when dialogue is being written for indie movies, a lot of times the dialogue especially is something that can be really difficult to get right. And then even if it does in the script, it can be a difficult thing to pull off for the actors to actually have a natural flow in interacting with one another. A lot of times it just sounds like they're reciting lines from memory as opposed to actually having a conversation. And this avoids that. I actually believed in the friendship between these four. Now, what about this movie did I not care for? What prevented it from gelling fully? Well, I have to kind of chalk that up to three major things, and I'm going to go ahead and save the biggest one for last. But the first thing I want to address is the pacing. The pacing on an overall timeline is really what was at fault here. This actually had some technical elements that, beat by beat, worked really well. For instance, as they're interacting with one another, there are moments in which we will see a character that is bloody and has a kind of an aftermath quality to it, the future being interjected into the present kind of thing. And it's only for a few seconds, but it's enough to kind of break things up to show that we are getting somewhere. We are moving forward, and there is something that is going to be extraordinary happening. Sometimes it's a dream, or at least it alludes that it's a dream, sometimes not. But even so, it worked in that moment, and I did appreciate that. But for the entirety of the timeline, we're talking about a movie that clocks in at about an hour and 45 minutes, and I would have to say that the ball really didn't start rolling until the hour and 15-minute mark. And that's a long time for character introduction, character development, and so on and so forth, to actually get to the meat of what's going on, those little nuggets that we've been exposed to actually come to fruition. The second thing is the soundtrack, and I'm really not going to fault the movie too heavily on that. Sometimes, especially with micro-budget indies, you just kind of get what you are able to afford in terms of distribution and rights and so on and so forth. And in this case, I would have to say that this actually kind of worked against the movie. Granted, it's better than having nothing at all, because that would have put this on a bit of a snooze fest level. But even so, it was a little bit of an obnoxious synthwave kind of thing that just kind of took over the scene rather than adding to it. And the third and biggest flaw that I found in this movie was the conflict. I really didn't understand exactly what the conflict was. As we were going through this movie, we had the characters interacting with one another. It wasn't all good times. It was sometimes a little bit of infighting, sometimes not believing one another as they saw things like that, which, okay, fine, that works on kind of a microcosm conflict kind of thing for that particular scene, but overall, what's the point? See, typically in a screenplay, and it doesn't have to follow this format, but you'd honestly be surprised at how many major motion pictures do, is we establish the characters, we establish the stakes, and then we establish the conflict. What is standing in their way to get to the point of their goals? Now that we know them, we know what they are like, we know what their goals are, what is the moment in which something is standing in their way? And then the rest of the movie builds on them overcoming that conflict. And in this case, I really didn't understand exactly what the conflict was supposed to be. I told you already that it didn't really get rolling until an hour and 15 minutes in. It only left half an hour to the rest of the movie. And at that point, I could see the conflict being survive when that happened. But beyond that, I really didn't much see the point. There was a lot of good sense of foreboding, and that's one thing that this movie did extraordinarily well, was it built up a sense of foreboding and suspense throughout, which was great. Unfortunately, it also did rely on some very cheap jump scares, which I wasn't a big fan of, but even so, this actually had a good level of suspense and tension to it. But ultimately, I didn't understand to what end. At one point, the four characters go to a party with some of the locals, and that was a great scene in terms of building that level of suspense, building that level of tension. Something was definitely not quite right there, and it really didn't start to come to the surface until towards the end, and they got the heck out of there, but it really didn't have any lasting impact, and it didn't have any overlapping suspense in terms of the entirety of the movie. It just kind of was contained in that scene. So it instilled a sense of dread, but beyond that, it didn't really seem to have any purpose whatsoever. So if you're in the mood for a well-rounded roller coaster ride of a horror movie that's going to scare the pants off of you, this is probably one to pass on. But if you like indie films and you kind of like taking a look at what works and what doesn't and analyzing them in a way that's constructive and taking a look at first-time directors' material, I actually really do recommend this one because on an analytical level, it's a very fascinating watch. But beyond that, if you're just in the mood for a good horror movie, solid through and through, I would have to say that maybe this is worth passing on. That should about do it. That's my recommendation, or however much I can give, for the 2021 movie, Death Trip. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I look forward to seeing you on my next review. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.